when John Wayne Gacy was arrested in December 1978 and the bodies beneath his house began to surface. The horror of his crimes stunned the world. But it was in the courtroom, beginning in 1980, that the full story of his monstrous double life unfolded before the public. The trial of John Wayne Gacy was not merely a legal proceeding. It was a cultural reckoning, a confrontation with the unimaginable fact that an ordinary man had committed extraordinary evil while hiding in plain sight. The prosecution approached the trial with a straightforward but devastating case. 33 young men and boys had vanished, many last seen in Gacy's company. 29 were found buried beneath his house, others in the Des Plaines River. The evidence collected from his home, handcuffs, rope, pornography, driver's licenses, clothing, personal items belonging to victims, spoke volumes. Witnesses testified to Gacy's methods, recounting the handcuff trick and his manipulation of vulnerable youths. Prosecutors framed Gacy as a calculating predator who lured his victims with offers of work, friendship, or shelter, only to imprison, assault, and kill them. The scale and brutality of the crimes left little room for doubt. John Wayne Gacy was guilty of murder on a staggering level. Yet the trial was not merely about guilt, it was about sanity. Gacy's defense team, recognizing the overwhelming weight of evidence, built their case around the plea of insanity. They argued that no sane man could kill 33 people, burying many beneath his own home, and still live an apparently normal life above. The defense portrayed Gacy as suffering from multiple personality disorder, suggesting that his killings were carried out by an alternate persona beyond his conscious control. They emphasized his traumatic childhood, his abusive father, and his long struggle with his sexuality, attempting to frame his crimes as the tragic outcome of a deeply fractured psyche. The prosecution countered forcefully. They argued that Gacy's actions were deliberate, calculated, and methodical. He had lured victims with deception, controlled them with handcuffs, killed them with ropes, and concealed their bodies with care. He had lied to police, manipulated friends, and maintained a facade of normalcy for years. These were not the acts of a man divorced from reality, prosecutors insisted, but of one who knew exactly what he was doing. They brought in psychological experts who testified that Gacy exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, what many would call psychopathy, but that he was not insane. He understood right from wrong, they argued. He simply did not care. The trial became a battle between competing visions of Gacy, the insane man, lost in fractured identities, or the remorseless killer, fully aware of his choices. Expert witnesses debated his mental state, combing through his childhood, his behavior, and his statements. Some testified that he had dissociative tendencies, that he sometimes referred to his other self as Jack, who committed the murders. Others dismissed these claims as manipulations designed to escape responsibility. The jury was forced to weigh not only the evidence of murder, but the complex, murky question of Gacy's mind. Beyond the legal arguments, the trial was also a media spectacle. The courtroom in Cook County was packed with journalists, spectators, and family members of victims. The sheer scale of the crimes, 33 lives, made the case unlike any other in American history. Every day, newspapers ran front-page stories recounting the gruesome details of the crawl space and the chilling testimony of witnesses. The image of Gacy as the killer clown dominated headlines, cementing his crimes in the public imagination. Gacy himself seemed to relish the attention. At times he smiled in court, joked with guards, or sketched drawings that he distributed to the curious. He alternated between arrogance and denial, sometimes insisting he had no memory of certain killings, other times mocking the prosecution's portrayal of him. To many observers, his behavior seemed callous, even gleeful, as though he viewed the trial not as a judgment on his life, but as another stage upon which to perform. His lack of visible remorse only deepened the horror felt by families and the public alike. The testimony of victims' families was among the most heart-wrenching aspects of the trial. Parents spoke of their sons' disappearances, the long months of not knowing, the crushing confirmation when remains were identified. Their grief filled the courtroom, a stark counterpoint to Gacy's smirks and denials. Jurors later recounted how the weight of this testimony, combined with the overwhelming physical evidence, left little doubt in their minds about Gacy's guilt. The defense's plea of insanity faltered under scrutiny. Jurors were unconvinced by claims of multiple personalities or dissociation. The meticulous way Gacy conducted his crimes, the luring, the control, the concealment, suggested not a fractured mind but a calculating predator. His ability to maintain a business, host parties, and volunteer as a clown while simultaneously killing and burying victims only reinforced the prosecution's argument. John Wayne Gacy knew what he was doing, and he chose to do it repeatedly. On March 12, 1980, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. John Wayne Gacy was found guilty of 33 counts of murder. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the families of victims, though nothing could erase their loss. In the sentencing phase, the jury recommended the death penalty. Gacy was formally sentenced to death for 12 of the murders, to be carried out by lethal injection. The trial of John Wayne Gacy marked a watershed in American criminal history. It underscored the challenges of prosecuting serial killers whose crimes were so vast and grotesque that they seemed beyond comprehension. It highlighted the role of psychology in the courtroom, where questions of sanity and responsibility clashed in the face of overwhelming evidence. And it revealed the power of persistence, of families who demanded answers, detectives who refused to be deceived, and prosecutors who built a case that pierced through the mask of normalcy. For the public, the trial cemented Gacy's image not just as a killer but as a symbol of hidden evil. The smiling clown who entertained children had become the face of monstrous duplicity. The courtroom stripped away his pretenses, exposing him as a man who had chosen, again and again, to exploit trust and destroy lives. The jury's verdict, delivered with unanimity, was not only a legal judgment but a cultural one. John Wayne Gacy was guilty, not just in law, but in the collective conscience of a horrified nation. The trial of John Wayne Gacy was not only a legal contest between prosecution and defense, it was also a profound examination of the human mind at its darkest extremes. How could a man kill 33 young men and boys, bury them beneath his own home, and still function as a business owner, political volunteer, and neighbor? Was he insane, driven by uncontrollable impulses? Or was he a calculating predator, fully aware of his actions but devoid of conscience? These questions brought psychologists and psychiatrists into the center of the courtroom, where their testimonies revealed as much about the era's understanding of mental illness as they did about Gacy himself. From the start, Gacy's defense rested heavily on the argument of insanity. His lawyers argued that no sane man could possibly commit the scale of atrocities attributed to him. They suggested that Gacy lived with multiple personalities, fractured identities that allowed him to commit murders, while other parts of his psyche remained unaware. According to this theory, Jack, an alternate persona Gacy sometimes invoked, was the one responsible for the killings, while John, the genial contractor and clown, remained innocent. It was an argument designed to humanize Gacy, to suggest that he was not wholly responsible for his actions, that he was as much victim of his fractured mind as his victims were of his violence. Psychologists and psychiatrists called by the defense echoed this interpretation, diagnosing Gacy with borderline personality disorder or multiple personality disorder, conditions that might explain his capacity for compartmentalization. They pointed to his traumatic childhood, his father's relentless abuse, and the conflict between his public persona and his suppressed sexual desires as evidence of a psyche splintered by shame and violence. In this framing, the murders were not calculated acts of evil but eruptions from a tormented and broken mind. The prosecution, however, countered with its own experts who painted a very different portrait. Their psychologists testified that Gacy did not suffer from multiple personalities, nor was he incapable of distinguishing right from wrong. Instead, they argued, he was a textbook example of antisocial personality disorder, what the public more commonly knows as psychopathy or sociopathy. Individuals with this disorder, they explained, exhibit superficial charm, manipulativeness, lack of empathy, and a chilling indifference to the suffering of others. These traits aligned perfectly with Gacy's behavior. He lured victims with lies, controlled them with cunning tricks, and killed them with detached precision. He concealed their bodies carefully, manipulated police, and maintained his public persona. Such behaviors, prosecutors emphasized, required awareness, planning, and deliberate choice. One prosecution expert noted that Gacy's actions betrayed not delusion, but calculation. He knew the difference between right and wrong, the psychologist testified. He simply did not care. This distinction was crucial in legal terms. The insanity defense depended on proving that Gacy was unable to comprehend the nature of his actions or to distinguish between morality and immorality. The prosecution argued, convincingly, that Gacy not only comprehended but reveled in his ability to deceive, manipulate, and dominate. The testimony revealed the complexity of the human mind when twisted toward cruelty. On the one hand, Gacy's childhood and personal struggles could not be ignored. His father's abuse left him with deep scars of insecurity and shame, while the repression of his sexuality in a conservative era forced him into layers of secrecy. These factors, experts acknowledged, contributed to the psychological landscape in which his predatory behavior developed, but they stopped short of excusing him. Many individuals endured abusive childhoods or repression without becoming killers. Gacy's choices, they argued, marked the line between woundedness and monstrosity. Psychological analysis also shed light on Gacy's extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. He maintained two lives with startling efficiency: the jovial clown and political volunteer on one side, the remorseless killer on the other. Some experts suggested that this compartmentalization bordered on dissociation, allowing him to commit crimes while suppressing recognition of their horror. Others saw it as the cold precision of a psychopath, someone who wore masks at will, shifting seamlessly between roles to suit his purposes. Either way, the duality of Gacy's existence became one of the defining features of his psychological profile. After his conviction, further psychological evaluations continued during his years on death row. In interviews, Gacy oscillated between denial, minimization, and arrogance. Sometimes he insisted that he had killed no one, blaming former employees for the murders. At other times, he admitted to killing but claimed not to remember details, suggesting dissociation. And in still other moments, he spoke with chilling pride, boasting that clowns can get away with murder, or dismissing his victims as mere objects of opportunity. This inconsistency baffled some observers but reinforced for many psychologists the view that Gacy was not insane, but manipulative, tailoring his statements to serve whatever narrative benefited him at the moment. Criminologists studying Gacy have since emphasized his case as a watershed in the understanding of serial killers. His crimes highlighted the dangers of underestimating predators who blend into society. Unlike killers who operated in isolation or obvious deviance, Gacy thrived in the very heart of his community. His ability to project normalcy forced experts to rethink the notion of what a killer looks like. He was not an outcast, but a neighbor, not a stranger lurking in shadows, but a man who entertained children and attended political dinners. Gacy demonstrated with chilling clarity that psychopathy could wear a mask of charm and civic engagement, making detection far more difficult. The debates around his mental state also influenced legal and psychological discourse about the insanity defense. Gacy's case became an example of the difficulty in distinguishing between madness and evil. Was he insane, driven by fractured personalities beyond his control? Or was he rational, calculating, and simply devoid of conscience? The jury's rejection of the insanity defense underscored a societal desire to draw a firm line. Mental illness may explain aspects of behavior, but it does not absolve deliberate, repeated acts of cruelty. Gacy, the jury concluded, knew what he was doing. He was sane and therefore accountable. In the years since his execution, psychologists and criminologists have continued to analyze his case, often using it as a teaching tool. His crimes illustrate the traits of psychopathy, the mechanisms of manipulation, and the dangers of underestimating those who seem outwardly ordinary. His case has also fed into the broader cultural fascination with the killer next door, a figure who embodies the fear that evil can hide behind the most unassuming smile. Ultimately, the psychological analyses of John Wayne Gacy reveal a man who defied simple categorization. He was not wholly insane, though his mind bore scars of trauma and repression. He was not merely evil in the abstract, though his actions embodied cruelty. He was, instead, a chilling reminder of how manipulation, compartmentalization, and lack of empathy can combine into something monstrous. His case forced both the legal system and the field of psychology to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior, that the capacity for horror can coexist with charm, that the mask of normalcy can conceal unimaginable darkness, and that understanding the mind of a killer does not always mean excusing it. On March 12, 1980, the jury in Cook County returned its verdict. John Wayne Gacy was guilty on 33 counts of murder. The weight of the decision reflected the magnitude of the crimes, a tally of lives extinguished that had no precedent in American legal history at the time. For the families of the victims, the verdict was both a relief and a painful reminder of the loss that could never be undone. For Gacy himself, the trial was the end of one performance and the beginning of another, as his role shifted from defendant to condemned man. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors argued that the sheer scale and brutality of Gacy's crimes left no room for mercy. They emphasized his lack of remorse, his manipulation of victims, and the meticulous concealment of bodies beneath his home. The jury agreed. Gacy was sentenced to death for 12 of the murders and given life sentences for the others. The method of execution would be lethal injection, a relatively new procedure at the time in Illinois. The judge, in announcing the sentence, remarked that the enormity of the crimes demanded the ultimate punishment. With the verdict delivered, Gacy's life entered a new phase, the long years of death row at Menard Correctional Center. For a man who had thrived on activity, community, and control, confinement was both a punishment and a stage upon which he crafted yet another persona. He became a fixture on death row, infamous among both inmates and guards. His cell became a place of correspondence, artwork, and interviews. He wrote letters to strangers, exchanged jokes with reporters, and granted interviews to anyone willing to listen. In these interviews, Gacy often displayed the same contradictions that had defined him for decades. Sometimes he denied the murders entirely, insisting that he had been framed, that others had buried bodies beneath his house without his knowledge. At other times, he admitted to killings, but downplayed his responsibility, claiming lapses of memory or blaming stress and circumstances. And in still other moments, he boasted with chilling pride, dismissing his victims as worthless or reveling in the macabre notoriety he had achieved. His words were a mixture of denial, minimization, and arrogance, reinforcing for many observers the view that he was not insane, but manipulative to the end. One of the more bizarre aspects of Gacy's time on death row was his venture into art. He began painting prolifically, producing hundreds of canvases that he sold through galleries and mail-order catalogs. Many of his works depicted clowns, some as Pogo, others more abstract or grotesque, while others portrayed Disney characters, religious scenes, or self-portraits. For some collectors, the paintings became macabre curiosities, artifacts of infamy. For others, they were offensive reminders of his crimes, commodifying horror into art. Debates raged over whether the sale of such works was a form of exploitation or simply the expression of a condemned man. Meanwhile, Gacy's legal team pursued a long series of appeals, stretching across more than a decade. His lawyers argued procedural errors, challenged evidence, and at times revived claims of insanity. The appeals moved slowly through the courts, reflecting both the seriousness of capital punishment and the complexity of his case. Each time, the courts upheld the original verdict and sentence. The sheer weight of evidence, the testimony of witnesses, and the discovery of bodies beneath his home left little room for doubt. As the years passed, public perception of Gacy hardened. To most Americans, he was not a man struggling with mental illness or a product of his environment, but a remorseless predator who had destroyed dozens of lives. The image of the killer clown dominated cultural memory, and Gacy became shorthand for hidden evil, the neighbor who seemed ordinary but concealed horror. Television documentaries, books, and true crime features ensured that his name remained in the public consciousness, not as a subject of sympathy, but as a symbol of monstrosity. Yet Gacy himself seemed to thrive on the attention. He granted interviews where he mocked the legal system, complained of mistreatment, or spun elaborate conspiracies about his innocence. He spoke of politics, religion, and art with the same ease as he once hosted barbecues. For many observers, his words revealed a man incapable of genuine remorse, someone who continued to manipulate narratives to suit himself. Even as the execution date drew nearer, he refused to accept full responsibility, leaving families of victims with little sense of closure. The years on death row also raised broader questions about justice and punishment. Some argued that the decades-long appeals process delayed closure for the victims' families, prolonging their agony. Others contended that the slow pace was necessary to ensure fairness in capital cases. For Illinois, the Gacy case became one of the most prominent examples of both the necessity and the burden of the death penalty, a debate that would continue long after his execution. By the early 1990s, the final appeals had run their course. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld his conviction, and federal courts declined to intervene. The governor signed his death warrant, setting May 10, 1994, as the date of execution. As the day approached, media interest surged. Reporters camped outside the prison. Families of victims prepared for the end of a long chapter, and the public braced for the final act in a saga that had haunted them for more than 15 years. Convicted and condemned, John Wayne Gacy spent his final years as he had lived much of his life, performing, manipulating, and refusing to relinquish control of the narrative. Yet no matter how many paintings he sold, no matter how many interviews he gave, no matter how many claims of innocence he spun, the verdict remained unchanged. He was guilty, and he would die by lethal injection. For the families of his victims, the execution would not restore what was lost, but it would close the door on the man who had inflicted so much pain. By the spring of 1994, John Wayne Gacy had been on death row for more than 14 years. In that time, he had transformed from a community contractor and political volunteer into one of the most infamous figures in American criminal history. His paintings had been exhibited and sold. His interviews had sparked outrage and fascination, and his name had become synonymous with hidden evil. Yet the long legal battles that had delayed his execution finally came to an end. The Illinois Supreme Court had upheld his sentence. Federal appeals had been exhausted, and Governor Jim Edgar signed his death warrant. May 10, 1994, was set as the day John Wayne Gacy would die. In the days leading up to his execution, Gacy remained characteristically contradictory. He granted interviews, continuing to insist that he was not guilty of the murders for which he had been convicted. He claimed that others had buried bodies beneath his house, or that the police had framed him. At times, he dismissed the murders entirely, as though his decades-long notoriety was nothing but a fabrication. For families of victims and members of the public, these final denials were infuriating reminders of his refusal to acknowledge responsibility. He had taken dozens of lives, yet in the face of his own death, he remained a manipulator, clinging to a narrative of innocence no one believed. The night before his execution, Gacy was transferred to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, where Illinois carried out executions. He was offered the opportunity to order a last meal, and he did so with indulgent familiarity. A dozen deep-fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC original recipe chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. The choice of fried chicken drew particular attention, as it harkened back to his earlier life managing KFC franchises in Iowa. Some observers remarked bitterly that even in his final hours, Gacy seemed to revel in grotesque symbolism. On the evening of May 9th, Gacy spent time with his spiritual advisor, Father Anthony Spilatro, a Catholic priest who prayed with him and heard his final confession. He also received visits from his sisters, who maintained some degree of loyalty to him, despite the enormity of his crimes. Outside the prison, meanwhile, a crowd of protesters and demonstrators gathered. Some opposed the death penalty, carrying signs denouncing state-sanctioned killing. Others, including families of victims, gathered to witness what they saw as the final act of justice. The atmosphere outside was both somber and carnival-like, with vendors selling hot dogs, T-shirts, and pins that read, "No tears for the clown." The execution of John Wayne Gacy had become not only a legal event, but a cultural spectacle. Shortly before midnight on May 9, 1994, Gacy was escorted into the execution chamber. Witnesses described him as calm, even defiant. He was strapped to a gurney, intravenous lines inserted into his arms. As the final moment approached, he was asked if he had any last words. Gacy's response, characteristic of his arrogance and contempt, shocked many. "Kiss my ass." The words were defiant, dismissive, and utterly devoid of remorse. For families of victims, they were confirmation that the man who had taken so much from them would never offer the closure of an apology. At 12:58 a.m. on May 10, 1994, the lethal injection was administered. Within minutes, John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. For some, his final moments were anticlimactic compared to the scale of his crimes. There was no drama, No last confession, no tears, just a brief, clinical ending to a man who had caused immeasurable suffering. Yet for the families of victims, the execution carried profound weight. It was not justice in the sense of restoring what had been lost, but it was closure in the sense of ending his long presence on earth. Reactions to his death varied. Families of the victims expressed relief, though their grief remained raw. Some spoke of feeling a burden lifted, as though a chapter of torment had finally closed. Others acknowledged that no execution could undo the pain or bring their loved ones back. For them, Gacy's death was symbolic, a public acknowledgement that society had confronted his crimes and delivered its verdict. Among the public, Gacy's execution sparked debates about the death penalty. Supporters saw it as the only fitting punishment for a man who had destroyed 33 lives. Opponents argued that execution was too swift, too merciful, compared to the suffering he had inflicted. Some suggested that his years on death row, granting interviews and painting clowns, had given him more attention than he deserved. Yet regardless of one's stance on capital punishment, few questioned the necessity of holding Gacy accountable. His crimes were so vast, his lack of remorse so stark, that any outcome short of the death penalty would have seemed inconceivable to many. In the years that followed, the symbolism of his execution continued to resonate. His last words, crude and defiant, became a grim epitaph, reflecting his lifelong refusal to accept responsibility. His paintings, sold at auction and sometimes destroyed in public ceremonies, remained controversial reminders of his lingering presence in the cultural imagination. The house on Somerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979, long before his execution, but the ground where it stood remained haunted in memory, a physical space forever linked to horror. The execution of John Wayne Gacy closed a legal chapter but did not end his legacy. His crimes remained embedded in the national consciousness, fueling books, documentaries, and debates about serial killers, law enforcement, and the nature of evil. The families of his victims carried on, bearing the scars of loss that no punishment could erase. For them, May 10th, 1994, was a day of reckoning, but also a reminder of lives stolen too soon. Gacy's death also marked a moment of reflection for American society. His case had exposed the dangers of overlooking missing youths, the failures of a system that dismissed disappearances, and the need for greater vigilance against predators who exploit trust. It forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable truth that monsters do not always lurk in shadows. Sometimes they host barbecues, volunteer at parades, and paint smiles on their faces. His execution may have ended his life, but the lessons of his crimes continued to reverberate. In the end, John Wayne Gacy died as he had lived, manipulative, defiant, and devoid of remorse. The state of Illinois carried out its duty, but the true legacy of that night lay not in the death of the killer, but in the enduring memory of his victims. Their names, too often overshadowed by the infamy of the man who took their lives, remain the true heart of the story. The execution closed the chapter on Gacy, but it was never about him alone. It was about the 33 young men whose lives he extinguished, and the countless families and communities left to live with the aftermath. The execution of John Wayne Gacy in 1994 marked the end of his life, but not the end of his story. In many ways, his death was merely the beginning of his transformation into a cultural symbol, a dark icon whose shadow still looms over American memory. For the families of victims, his execution provided closure. For criminologists, it closed the book on one of the largest serial murder cases in U.S. history. But for society at large, John Wayne Gacy became more than a criminal. He became a metaphor, a cautionary tale, and disturbingly, a figure of enduring fascination. One of the most immediate legacies of Gacy's crimes was their effect on the public's perception of safety in suburban America. The idealized vision of the suburbs as havens of security had already been shaken in the 1970s by rising crime rates. But Gacy's case struck at the heart of suburban identity. His house on Somerdale Avenue was indistinguishable from the hundreds of other modest homes in Norwood Park. He was a contractor, a party host, a clown who entertained children. In short, he embodied the image of the trustworthy neighbor. The revelation that beneath this facade lay a mass grave shattered the illusion of suburban safety. If such horrors could exist in a quiet neighborhood, they could exist anywhere. This sense of violated trust became a recurring theme in the way Gacy was remembered. He was not a stranger lurking in dark alleys, but a man embedded in his community, someone whose very normalcy was the mask that enabled his crimes. The phrase, "the killer next door," became a chilling shorthand in media and criminology, capturing the fear that predators might hide in plain sight, disguised by the ordinary trappings of everyday life. Gacy was not alone in this archetype. Figures like Dennis Rader, the BTK killer, and Ted Bundy would also embody it. But Gacy's clown persona made his version uniquely grotesque. The cultural impact of the clown mask cannot be overstated. Pogo the clown, once a symbol of Gacy's community service, became in the public imagination a symbol of distorted innocence. The clown, traditionally associated with laughter and childhood joy, was transformed into an image of menace. Gacy's crimes are often credited with fueling the modern phenomenon of coulrophobia, the fear of clowns, which exploded in the decades that followed. Popular culture seized on the image of the evil clown, from Stephen King's It in 1986 to countless films, television shows, and urban legends. Though Gacy did not invent the archetype of the sinister clown, he embodied it so vividly that his shadow lingers over every iteration that followed. Beyond cultural fear, Gacy's crimes influenced the field of criminology and law enforcement. His case highlighted the failures of the system in the 1970s, when missing boys were too often dismissed as runaways. The discovery that dozens of disappearances had gone unconnected for years led to reforms in how missing persons cases were handled. Greater emphasis was placed on investigating the disappearances of teenagers, even those estranged from their families. The case also contributed to the growing recognition of patterns in serial crime, influencing the development of profiling techniques by the FBI and other agencies. Gacy's manipulative charm, his double life, and his ritualistic methods became textbook examples for the study of psychopathy and sexual homicide. In the cultural realm, Gacy's story became a mainstay of the true crime genre. Books, documentaries, and television specials dissected his life and crimes, each retelling amplifying the horror while searching for answers. His name entered the pantheon of America's most infamous killers, alongside figures like Bundy, Dahmer, and the Zodiac. For many, he came to embody not just one man's crimes, but the broader fascination with evil. The question of how an ordinary person could conceal such extraordinary cruelty. At the same time, Gacy himself continued to manipulate his legacy from beyond the grave through his artwork. The paintings he created on death row became objects of controversy, with some collectors seeking them as morbid curiosities and others burning them in protest. Art auctions featuring his clown portraits drew media attention and public outrage as families of victims decried the commodification of their grief. The paintings symbolized the grotesque way in which Gacy continued to exert influence, turning horror into spectacle even after his death. The cultural fixation on Gacy also revealed deeper societal anxieties about identity and trust. His double life forced Americans to confront the possibility that evil is not always easily recognizable. The mask of the clown, the facade of the contractor, the role of political volunteer. All of these roles were designed to inspire trust. That they concealed predation forced a reevaluation of how much trust should be placed in appearances. In this sense, Gacy's crimes resonated far beyond their immediate horror, tapping into existential fears about deception, betrayal, and the fragility of social bonds. For the families of his victims, however, the legacy was more personal and painful. While Gacy's name became infamous, the identities of the boys and young men he killed were too often overshadowed. Efforts have been made in recent decades to refocus attention on the victims, to remember them as individuals with hopes, families, and futures, rather than as footnotes in the story of their killer. Advances in DNA technology have even allowed for the identification of some victims who remained nameless for decades, offering belated closure to families still haunted by uncertainty. Gacy's impact on law enforcement, criminology, and culture underscores the paradox of serial killers in public memory. They are both reviled and fixated upon, condemned and endlessly analyzed. Gacy in particular became a symbol of duplicity, of the smiling mask that hides brutality. His legacy is not only one of horror, but of caution, a reminder that vigilance is necessary, that appearances can deceive, and that communities must not dismiss the vulnerable as disposable. Nearly 3 decades after his execution, Gacy remains an enduring figure in the cultural landscape. His crimes are referenced in documentaries, dramatizations, and academic studies. His name has become shorthand for hidden evil, his clown persona an icon of corrupted innocence. Yet his most enduring legacy may be the lessons drawn from his case, the need for better systems to protect the vulnerable, the importance of investigating disappearances seriously, and the recognition that monstrosity can wear the face of the ordinary. In the end, John Wayne Gacy's legacy is one of horror, but also of warning. He forced America to look closely at itself, at its illusions of safety, at its failures to protect its children, and at the unsettling truth that evil often hides behind the most trusted masks. His crimes reverberated far beyond the walls of his crawl space, shaping law enforcement, culture, and memory. And while he sought to leave behind the grotesque symbol of the clown, what remains is not his painted smile, but the enduring reminder of the lives he stole and the vigilance required to prevent such horrors from happening again. Of all the images associated with John Wayne Gacy, none has proven more enduring or disturbing than that of the clown. Long before the first body was uncovered in his crawl space, Gacy had cultivated his alter ego, Pogo the Clown, as a persona for parties, parades, and charity events. In the years since his crimes were revealed, the painted smile and oversized costume have become synonymous with his duplicity, a mask of innocence concealing unspeakable horror. The cultural impact of this image is so profound that Gacy's legacy is inseparable from the clown archetype, which in his hands was twisted from laughter into menace. The origins of Pogo were seemingly benign. In the early 1970s, after Gacy had established his contracting business and sought to further immerse himself in community life, he joined a volunteer group known as the Jolly Joker Clown Club. Members performed at children's hospitals, fundraising events, and neighborhood gatherings, bringing joy to children through simple tricks, balloons, and exaggerated antics. Gacy created his own character, Pogo, whose name suggested playful, bouncing energy. In photographs from the period, he can be seen in bright costumes, his face painted in heavy white makeup, red lips drawn in wide curves, and eyes outlined in blue or black. parents and children alike, he seemed merely eccentric, a man with a peculiar but harmless hobby. Yet even at this stage, Gacy's clown persona carried unsettling undertones. Professional clowns often paint their features with rounded shapes, curved lips, soft eyes, to convey friendliness. Gacy, by contrast, painted sharp angles and exaggerated points. His painted grin was not rounded but jagged, giving Pogo a menacing edge. To those versed in clown tradition, the choice was striking. It suggested not lightheartedness, but something harsher, more aggressive. In hindsight, the makeup seemed less an accident than a reflection of Gacy's inner duplicity. The symbolism of Pogo grew after his crimes were uncovered. The revelation that a man who dressed as a clown for children's events had also buried dozens of victims beneath his home was almost too much for the public to process. The dissonance between the innocence of the clown and the horror of the killer created a cultural shockwave. Newspapers and television programs seized upon the image, dubbing him the killer clown. The phrase, though reductive, captured the essence of what made his crimes uniquely terrifying. The realization that what seemed most innocent could mask what was most evil. The clown has long been a figure of ambiguity in human culture. Historically, clowns, jesters, and fools occupy a liminal space between comedy and menace. They exaggerate human features, mock conventions, and disrupt order, often walking the line between joy and unease. For many children, clowns evoke not laughter but discomfort. Their painted faces hide expressions. Their exaggerated features obscure sincerity. Gacy's adoption of the clown persona tapped into this deeper ambivalence. He gave cultural form to a fear that had lingered unarticulated, that behind the painted mask might lie something sinister. After Gacy's arrest, this fear exploded into the cultural mainstream. The evil clown archetype, though not invented by Gacy, gained enormous traction from his association. In 1986, Stephen King's novel, it introduced Pennywise, a monstrous clown who preyed upon children, a figure explicitly linked in public memory to Gacy. Movies, television shows, and urban legends followed, cementing the association between clowns and menace. What had once been a niche discomfort became a widespread cultural fear known as coulrophobia. Parents who once hired clowns for parties now eyed them with suspicion. The painted smile had become a symbol of deception. For criminologists and psychologists, Pogo the clown offered a disturbing metaphor for Gacy's double life. Just as the clown mask concealed the man beneath, Gacy's public persona concealed his crimes. The costume allowed him to perform innocence, to project an image of joy and service, even as his private life was defined by violence. In interviews after his arrest, Gacy sometimes dismissed the association, insisting that Pogo had nothing to do with his crimes. But the cultural imagination was not persuaded. For society, the clown became the perfect representation of his duplicity, the false smile covering horror, the mask that made deception possible. The grotesque power of the clown mask also lay in its symbolic inversion of childhood innocence. Clowns are supposed to entertain the young, to bring laughter to the vulnerable. Gacy weaponized that role, turning the figure of joy into a cloak for predation. His victims, though not children in the strictest sense, were young men and boys, many of them vulnerable and seeking guidance. In this sense, the clown persona mirrored the way he approached his victims, offering kindness, appearing trustworthy, only to betray that trust in the most brutal way. The clown was not incidental to his story. It was emblematic of the dynamic of deceit that defined his life. The cultural fascination with Gacy's clown persona persisted even after his execution. His clown paintings, created on death row, became macabre collector's items. Some buyers viewed them as disturbing trophies, while others destroyed them in acts of symbolic revenge. One group organized a public bonfire of Gacy's paintings, burning Pogo's painted face in defiance of the killer's lingering influence. These acts reflected the power of the image, the recognition that Pogo had become a symbol too potent to ignore. To own, destroy, or display his clown paintings was to engage directly with the cultural memory of his crimes. In broader cultural terms, Gacy's clown mask has come to symbolize the danger of appearances. It warns that evil does not always present itself with snarls or shadows. Sometimes it comes with a painted smile and a cheerful wave. The clown, once a figure of comedy, became in Gacy's hands a symbol of horror, and that inversion reshaped cultural perceptions. Today, the trope of the sinister clown permeates horror films, haunted attractions, and even everyday fears. While the archetype existed before Gacy, his crimes gave it visceral reality. Yet it is important to remember that the mask of Pogo, for all its cultural resonance, was only one part of Gacy's duplicity. He was not always in costume when he lured victims. He was not always wearing makeup when he killed. The clown symbol endures because it captures the essence of his deception. But the deeper lesson lies in the recognition that masks take many forms. Gacy's smile at a political rally, his neighborly friendliness at a barbecue, his role as contractor offering a job. All were masks, every bit as deceptive as Pogo's painted face. In the end, the legacy of Pogo the Clown is twofold. On one hand, it is a cultural artifact, a grotesque symbol that shaped horror tropes and fueled widespread fear of clowns. On the other, it is a cautionary tale about deception, about the ways evil cloaks itself in innocence to disarm suspicion. The clown mask did not make Gacy a killer, but it came to represent the essence of his crimes, the performance of joy hiding a reality of horror. For as long as his name is remembered, Pogo will remain its most haunting emblem. The story of John Wayne Gacy is, at one level, the story of a single man's crimes, a tale of manipulation, violence, and horror that unfolded in one Chicago neighborhood during the 1970s. Yet to view it only as a personal narrative is to miss its deeper resonance. Gacy's crimes exposed vulnerabilities in American society, challenged assumptions about safety, and forced law enforcement and the public to confront difficult truths about evil in the modern world. The broader implications of his case stretch beyond the crawl space of his home, raising questions that remain urgent decades later. One of the most immediate lessons from the Gacy case concerned the treatment of missing persons. Many of his victims were teenagers or young men who had run away from home, clashed with parents, or drifted on the edges of society. In the 1970s, such disappearances were often dismissed as voluntary. Police departments, stretched thin and lacking modern databases, frequently assumed that missing youths would return on their own. This assumption allowed predators like Gacy to operate unchecked. The families who reported their sons missing were often met with shrugs, told that boys of that age just take off. In hindsight, these failures were not merely bureaucratic oversights, but systemic blind spots, rooted in cultural assumptions about youth and authority. The disappearance of Robert Piest in 1978 illustrated how those blind spots could finally be challenged. Unlike some of Gacy's earlier victims, Piest was a boy with strong family ties and no history of running away. His vanishing was treated seriously from the start, leading to the surveillance and eventual capture of Gacy. The contrast underscored the uncomfortable truth. Society had been slow to respond because many of Gacy's victims came from vulnerable backgrounds. The implication was damning. Certain lives were given less urgency, and in that indifference, predators thrived. In response to cases like Gacy's, reforms in how law enforcement handled missing persons began to take shape. National databases such as the National Crime Information Center, NCIC, became more robust, and systems for tracking missing and exploited children gained momentum in the 1980s. Advocacy groups emerged, pressing for every disappearance to be treated as serious, regardless of background. Gacy's crimes, though horrifying, forced institutions to recognize that predators target the vulnerable and that neglecting those cases only compounds tragedy. The Gacy case also illuminated the nature of deception and the limits of appearances. Gacy was not a stranger hiding in shadows. He was a neighbor, a contractor, a volunteer, a man who shook hands with politicians and entertained children as Pogo the clown. His ability to blend into the fabric of suburban life challenged the assumption that danger could be easily spotted. He forced the uncomfortable realization that predators can hide behind masks of normalcy, that evil can reside next door. This awareness reshaped public attitudes, fueling anxieties about who could be trusted. In cultural terms, it contributed to a broader skepticism of appearances, a sense that the ordinary might conceal the sinister. For criminologists, Gacy's case became a pivotal study in psychopathy and manipulation. His traits, superficial charm, lack of empathy, calculated deception, were textbook, but his ability to operate undetected for so long highlighted the dangers of such personalities when embedded in communities. He was not merely deviant, but functional, maintaining a business, relationships, and social standing even while committing serial murder. This duality underscored the need for profiling techniques that could recognize patterns of predation beyond obvious deviance. The FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which was developing criminal profiling in the late 1970s, drew on cases like Gacy's to refine its understanding of serial offenders. The broader cultural implications were equally profound. Gacy's crimes struck at the heart of American optimism about the post-war suburbs. The neat lawns and friendly neighbors of Norwood Park were supposed to symbolize safety and stability. The discovery of bodies beneath one of those homes shattered that illusion. Gacy forced Americans to confront the fragility of their social structures, the possibility that evil was not out there, but embedded within the most familiar settings. This fear, the danger hidden in plain sight, has since become a recurring theme in true crime narratives, horror films, and collective anxieties. At the same time, Gacy's case raised uncomfortable questions about how society views sexuality and deviance. In the 1970s, homosexuality was still stigmatized, and the fact that Gacy targeted young men complicated public discourse. Some conflated his crimes with broader prejudices against gay men, reinforcing damaging stereotypes that equated queerness with predation. Others recognized the danger of such conflation and argued for clearer distinctions between consensual sexuality and violent exploitation. The debates surrounding Gacy's crimes reflected larger cultural tensions of the era, as America grappled with shifting norms around gender, sexuality, and identity. Another implication lies in the media's role. The killer clown narrative, while unforgettable, also risked reducing Gacy's victims to props in the story of his monstrosity. Headlines fixated on the grotesque imagery of the clown costume, sometimes overshadowing the individuality of the young men whose lives were stolen. The media's tendency to sensationalize crime, both educated and distorted, bringing attention to the dangers of hidden predators while also turning killers into grim celebrities. The fascination with Gacy, Bundy, and later Dahmer reflects society's simultaneous revulsion and attraction to stories of evil. The danger, of course, is that killers become infamous while victims become forgotten. The legacy of Gacy also speaks to the resilience of families and communities, scarred by tragedy. Many families of victims fought tirelessly to keep their loved ones' names alive, to push back against the overshadowing effect of Gacy's infamy. In later years, efforts to identify the remaining unidentified victims through DNA technology reflected this ongoing commitment to memory and closure. Their persistence ensured that the story was not only about the killer, but about those whose lives he destroyed. Perhaps the most sobering implication of the Gacy case is its reminder of the human capacity for compartmentalization. Gacy lived two lives with startling efficiency, one as a cheerful contractor and clown, the other as a remorseless predator. His ability to separate these identities challenged the idea that evil is always visible. It forced recognition of the psychological mechanisms: denial, compartmentalization, manipulation, that allow individuals to commit horrors while maintaining outward normalcy. This recognition, though unsettling, is vital for understanding and preventing future crimes. In the end, the broader implications of John Wayne Gacy's crimes extend far beyond the man himself. They reveal the fragility of assumptions about safety, the systemic failures that leave the vulnerable unprotected, and the cultural anxieties that emerge when innocence is betrayed. They underscore the need for vigilance, empathy, and accountability, for systems that take every disappearance seriously, for communities that look beyond appearances, and for a culture that remembers victims as more than footnotes. Gacy's story is one of horror, but its lessons are about responsibility. The responsibility to see, to protect, and to refuse complacency in the face of evil. The story of John Wayne Gacy is one of contradictions. He was a man who shook hands with politicians while burying bodies beneath his house, a clown who painted smiles on his face while extinguishing the lives of vulnerable young men, a neighbor who hosted parties while hiding one of the largest mass graves in American history. His life and crimes defied simple explanation, and in their complexity, they forced America to confront truths about evil, deception, and the fragility of trust. In many ways, Gacy's case was unprecedented. The sheer scale of his crimes, 33 murders confirmed, with suspicions of others, made him one of the most prolific killers in U.S. history. The discovery of his crawl space shocked the nation, a physical manifestation of hidden horror beneath the surface of everyday life. Law enforcement, the courts, and the public were all forced to grapple with the enormity of what had happened in a quiet Chicago suburb. His trial and conviction marked both a legal reckoning and a cultural one, ensuring that his name would forever occupy a place among the most notorious criminals of the 20th century. Yet the legacy of John Wayne Gacy extends beyond numbers and verdicts. His crimes revealed systemic flaws, the failures of police to take missing youth seriously, the societal tendency to dismiss the vulnerable, the lack of tools in the 1970s to track patterns across jurisdictions. In this sense, his case became a catalyst for change, pushing reforms in how missing persons cases were investigated and how law enforcement agencies cooperated. His crimes shocked America. They also galvanized it, spurring the development of systems that have since saved lives. Culturally, Gacy became a symbol of the killer next door, the predator who hides in plain sight. Unlike caricatures of monsters lurking in shadows, he thrived in the daylight of suburban normalcy. His duplicity was not incidental but essential. It was the mask that made his crimes possible. The enduring fascination with Gacy reflects both horror and warning. Horror at the grotesque inversion of innocence, represented by his clown persona, and warning that appearances can deceive, that evil often cloaks itself in trust. Psychologically, Gacy's story challenged assumptions about insanity and responsibility. His defense argued fractured identities, multiple personalities, a mind too tormented to be held accountable. But the jury, supported by psychological testimony, saw through the performance. Gacy was not delusional. He was manipulative. He understood right from wrong, and he chose wrong, again and again. His case underscored the dangers of psychopathy, the chilling emptiness of empathy that allows some individuals to commit atrocities without remorse. It was a lesson not just about one man, but about the nature of predation itself. For the families of victims, Gacy's name will always be inseparable from grief. Each body unearthed from the crawl space was not merely evidence, but a son, a brother, a friend. Their lives, too often overshadowed by the infamy of their killer, remain the true center of the story. The years of uncertainty, the pain of disappearance, the confirmation of death in such horrific circumstances. These were the burdens borne by families who deserved far better. If there is one enduring obligation in remembering Gacy, it is to remember them, the boys and young men whose lives were cut short, who deserved futures, not footnotes. Even in death, Gacy continued to cast a shadow. His execution in 1994 closed a legal chapter, but did not end his cultural presence. His clown paintings circulated in galleries and auctions. His name appeared in books and documentaries, and his crimes fueled the archetype of the evil clown in popular culture. In this sense, his legacy became both grotesque and cautionary, an enduring reminder of the fascination and danger of turning killers into icons. The challenge lies in balancing the study of such figures with the remembrance of their victims, ensuring that fascination does not eclipse empathy. Nearly half a century after his crimes, John Wayne Gacy's story still resonates because it touches on universal fears and questions. How do we recognize evil when it wears a friendly smile? How do we protect the vulnerable in societies that too easily dismiss them? How do we balance fascination with responsibility, ensuring that our focus remains on justice rather than spectacle? Gacy's case offers no simple answers, but it compels reflection. In the end, John Wayne Gacy was not a monster in the mythical sense. He was a man, ordinary in appearance, extraordinary in cruelty. That is what makes his story so haunting. Monsters are easy to dismiss. Men like Gacy force us to confront the reality that human beings, given the capacity for deception and devoid of conscience, can commit horrors beyond imagination. His crimes live on as both warning and wound, a reminder that vigilance is necessary, that trust must be earned, and that evil can hide where we least expect it. John Wayne Gacy's place in American criminal history is secure, not because of who he was, but because of what he revealed. He showed the cracks in systems of protection, the dangers of complacency, and the fragility of innocence in the face of manipulation. His crawl space, his clown mask, his arrogant last words, all remain etched in collective memory. But beyond the spectacle lies the truer, deeper lesson that the lives he stole matter more than the infamy he sought. To remember Gacy without remembering them is to allow his mask to linger. To honor their memory is to unmask him fully. To see him not as an icon of horror, but as a man whose choices destroyed others, and whose legacy must be a reminder of vigilance, empathy, and justice.